I'm delighted to be here with you today to share some ideas about the virtues of arguments and some related virtues. The virtues of arguers, including students, professors, and scholars, the virtues of the academy, one of whose most important functions is to train, inculcate, instill, and enable its pedagogical cohort of students and scholar professors in the virtues of arguments, and to offer a quick example of the implications of this briefly sketched account for an ongoing argumentative dispute at HLS. I'm offering an argument about argument, so it's a meta-argument. As I learned from my great teacher, Arthur Allen Leff, the great legal theorist, Pyrrhonian skeptic, anything you can do, I can do meta. With that in mind, I insist to myself that my remarks are PC, which I think is especially important here at Harvard Law School at this particular moment in its history and in the nation's history, by which I, of course, mean philosophically correct. And toward that end, I offer the Shiva-Pyrrho-Nietzsche axis of excellence, and I turn to the concept of virtue. My starting point is Aristotle's conception of arete, translated as virtue or excellence. If some object X is an F, for example, a knife, then the virtue of X as an F is that characteristic of X that makes X a good F. For example, the virtue of a knife will be cutting and so forth. X's virtue reflects its good performance of the function of F's. My conception of virtue, following Aristotle in this regard, is a purposive instrumental excellence, the excellence of an instrument at achieving a purpose whose efficacy of achievement is the measure of the excellence of the instrument. I depart from Aristotle in some important ways. I follow him in having a concept of virtue that is wider than moral virtue, and in the fuller version of this, I actually sort of dissolve the concept of moral virtue into the aesthetic. But I reject his well-known claim that a virtuous action for a human is a mean between two extremes, as, for example, courage is supposed to be a mean between the vice of cowardice and the vice of recklessness. I offer Barry Goldwater's challenge to Aristotle as sufficient refutation for the moment. I also reject his teleological view, Aristotle's teleological view, that every object that can bear virtue has an essence built into it. My view is that objects, actions, institutions that are bearers of virtue have no inherent essence but can be repurposed. A shoe can be a hammer can be used as a paperweight can be used as a doorstop. Vitally importantly, a human being has no essence. For example, the vital repurposing in the experience of a transgender person, gender is not an essence that is biologically given. This idea is central to existentialism and other philosophical theories that I find very influential. My concept of virtue says that metaphoric creativity strongly enhances, augments, and increases virtue. That is to say, virtue has a metaphoric character. A is B. Juliet is the sun. Life is a pencil which death sharpens. Metaphor is the dream work of language. The moon can be a slingshot. Enforcing a racially restricted covenant in state action under the United States 14th Amendment. I turn then to the virtues that are specific to arguments, which I call logocratic virtues. The logocratic method, which I've been teaching here for many years and abroad, is a method for assessing the virtues of arguments, including foremost the strengths and weaknesses of arguments. It's applicable to any kind of argument in any domain, including law. The virtues of arguments are wholly relative to their logical form, or at least some of them are. The four logical forms of arguments are deduction, induction, analogy, and inference to the best explanation. Inference to the best explanation includes inference to the best legal explanation, which is the fundamental mode of argument that every legal analyst uses when applying law to a potentially applicable set of facts. There are logical form-specific virtues. For example, there are virtues that are specific to deduction, specific to induction, specific to analogy, specific to inference to the best explanation. Can't go through any of the details of any but deduction, which is very simple. Its virtue is validity, which means that whenever all the premises of a valid deductive argument are true, the conclusion has to be true. The logocratic method also focuses on the virtues of argument that are independent of logical form, namely strength, the counterpart vice is weakness, as creative instrumental efficacy for achieving one or another or some combination of three goals or purpose. One is to use argument to infer conclusions from premises, which I call inferential strength. Example of the strongest possible internal strength is a valid deductive argument. If it's true that all employees at will can be fired for any reason, and it's true that Olga Monge is an employee at will, then it's true that Olga Monge can be fired for any reason. Dialectical strength is another logical form independent goal purpose. So you see the analogy, induction, deduction, abduction, they have characteristics that are specific to them, but these measures of strength, internal strength, dialectical strength, and the third one, rhetorical strength, are independent of the logical form. Dialectical strength is using argument to win competitions. It's possible within an argument, within an arguer, to have a dialectical competition. It's also the paradigmatic form of competition between litigants in law. In law, many of the most influential rules of competition come from rules of evidence and procedure, first among which are burdens of production and persuasion. A dialectical competition in which, of arguments which take place in the classroom and in the academy more generally is an agon, Greek for contest, and I make a philosophical and psychological claim. There can be a deep satisfaction in the virtuous exercise of dialectical strength, or indeed any of the types of strength of argument. The psychological mechanism here can involve suffering now to achieve greater results later, hence the possibility of joyful agony. Rhetorical strength is another logical form, independent goal purpose for an argument, using argument to persuade a target audience. I can give an example from the brilliant speech by Martin Luther King Jr., the I Have a Dream speech. I can talk more about that later, but that's an example of rhetorical strength. I move from the virtues of argument to the virtues of arguers. Arguers can display and feel deep satisfaction in displaying virtue in any of the three uses of argument, producing arguments that have internal strength, dialectical strength, or rhetorical strength. I move then from the virtues of argument and the virtues of arguers to the virtues of argument institutions. Institutions and procedures of law can bear virtue. For example, a very elegant paper by Joseph Raz argues that the rule of law is the virtue of law as an instrument of social coordination and control. Similarly, the academy can bear virtue, measured by, among others, two vital purposes. One is training law students to be virtuous arguers, meaning to instill in them logocratic virtues. A second is to provide arenas for the competition of arguments, including classroom and designated shared spaces for expression and competition of argument. A recent event at Harvard Law School has it that some students had been allowed to claim a public space downstairs in this building and control speech there by preventing other students from presenting certain modes of expression, posters, while enjoying that mode of expression themselves. The conclusion of my argument, my meta-argument, my argument about the virtue of argument, is that the academy should foster the skill, tool, weapon of reason and argument and use power to do so. There's a vast and vital difference between suppressing speech and enforcing norms of toleration. Power can be used virtuously or viciously. Using administrative power to enforce a norm of toleration against speech suppression is a virtuous use. I would like to see Harvard Law School create and maintain tolerant spaces for cooperation and opposition, for collaborative and competitive deliberation, for assertion and denial, spaces that are fields and arenas for both plowshares and swords. And this concludes my own joyful agony.